Hi and good evening, everybody. I'm speaking again today to Dr. Richard Sakwa on the Russian-Ukrainian war. A lot has happened since we last spoke. Notably, Donald Trump was elected as President of the United States of America. There's been a change in the US foreign policy establishment. There's been a negotiation between Zelensky and Trump, if one can call it that. And yeah, this is the topic of the day. So, Dr. Sakwa, welcome back to the channel.
It's my pleasure to be with you again.
Thank you. So, can you walk us back again through the origin of the conflict and take into account the audience that will probably listening to this will be in South Africa, and they obviously understand this through a colonial lens, if you will.
Yeah. Well, obviously, this war in Europe, you could say it's a third convulsion on the continent. And, I'm now putting it in that sequence: First World War, Second World War, Third World War, which obviously hasn't happened yet. But clearly, we are in the foothills of another of those spasms, if you could call it a European civil war, with huge consequences for the rest of the world, what we nowadays call the global south. Obviously, South Africa a major player for that. So that is clearly, just to say that we're still talking about this, the global character of the conflict is the fact that, as I've been arguing elsewhere, and we've talked about this earlier, is that I'm arguing that, at the moment we're meeting on the 80th anniversary of the establishment of the United Nations in 1945, the end of the Second World War, of course, we're marking it. And of course, it's 40 years since Gorbachev came to power, March 1985. But what's happened since then, of course, is that the international system, that is the community of 193 sovereign states in the United Nations, has matured. And this is what's so fascinating about South Africa, for example, taking a lead on the International Criminal Court vis-à-vis the situation in the Middle East, but also as an active member of the BRICS grouping: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and in the G20, and so many other things. So, in other words, the system has matured, which makes the immaturity of this war in Europe, in the Russo-Ukrainian war, all the more stark. It's stark because, have we learned nothing? We keep saying
Mm.
never again. And this war was eminently avoidable. Now, of course, the controversies will continue about the beginning of any conflict for decades, as we're still debating the start of the First World War, let alone anything else. So it's going to go. But I will identify four major elements. The first one is the failure within Ukraine to establish an inclusive, comfortable, multinational, multicultural community that is with the full linguistic rights of all the communities. It's not just Russians, Romanians, Hungarians, Yiddish people, Jewish people, whatever, in there. And they weren't so much persecuted, but they were not given adequate constitutional protection and the full advancement of a multilingual community. And I've always argued this was one of the great treasures of Ukraine. It was just and it's such a rich country, so many talented people, marvelous people. I've been to Ukraine many times, and they all wanted peace. They voted for peace after the Maidan Revolution in May 2014, when they voted for Poroshenko, and they voted for peace when the um, President Zelensky was elected in April 2019. So that's the first level. The second level is the constant tensions between Russia and Ukraine, which go back, obviously these are communities entwined for 1,000 years. Whereas the ultra nationalists within Ukraine say that Russian influence has always been a malign, dominant colonial influence, imperial influence. In part, that's true, of course, but it's more complicated than that. Ultimately, these are two communities entwined, a common Orthodox civilization, Eastern Slavic, relatively close languages, and so many and very close cultures, and indeed, endless and intermarriage and families. So it's rare to meet a Russian or Ukrainian which don't have relatives on one side or the other of the what is now the border. That's a second. That's a second number. The Russo-Ukrainian one. The third one is the European level. And this is most important. Within Europe, we've failed to build an inclusive, a comfortable security order after the end of the First Cold War. And the symptom of it is NATO enlargement. But that
Right.
itself reflected the deeper failure to bring Russia into the community. For example, after the Napoleonic Wars in Vienna, France, who basically started these wars for so long, was immediately made a full member of the community, the concert of Europe, uh, the balance of powers, the concert of powers, and so on. It was a full member. Russia, of course, was deliberately not. It was explicit. We now have more and more documentation how the late moments of George H.W. Bush's presidency and Clinton deliberately sought to contain Russia and never to allow it to become a major power. So that, of course, set up a tension. NATO enlargement was a symbol of all of that. The fourth one is, of course, the one which I've just alluded to, is the great power context. Russia, United States. United States, after 1945, established what I call the political West. This is the
Mm.
Atlantic power system, Europe, United States, Canada, and of course, Japan and South Korea and others. And this political West, Washington is number one. And of course, it delivered many public goods. It also delivered many public bads. 54 coups in the first Cold War, meant endless interventions, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and so on afterwards. So, and of course, what's interesting, we'll come on to that, of course, now, is the fact that this political West is beginning to fragment. But that's the four levels of the conflict. And in my view, bottom line, it's going to be very hard to solve one unless you solve all the others.
So
So it's,
I want to
yeah,
just add another point. Critiques to that narrative. I don't think many people actually disagree with what you say. They would add a fifth dimension, which they would say Russian nationalism reasserting itself, and it's often framed in a language of Russian imperialism wanting to reestablish itself. I mean, how do you speak to that point?
yeah. No, that's an argument which should be discussed and analysed. And quite clearly, Russia has come back after the end of the Cold War as with aspirations to be a great power. You can
Mm.
call it nationalistic, but certainly great power aspirations. However, to the idea that it's trying to and it is that is an important factor. And once it had the economic reconstituted itself economically under Putin, it was then going to assert itself, and that's always disruptive one way or the other. But and the same goes for China as well today, and indeed India or even South Africa. We all want
Right.
to. We
It's
need to
it's
find
it's
a way to get
it's
together.
Well, I mean, I spoke to an editor some time ago of the Sunday Times, and he made the point: just look at the map of the world, and you see Russia. I mean,
Yeah,
something
yeah,
has to something has to dominate that region. Well, domination
yeah,
might be a strong language, but
yeah.
somebody is going to assert itself influential, and that's I suppose
Yeah,
the point to
but
that.
But the bottom line is, it's not an imperial restoration. So Russia doesn't need an empire, and it's really genuinely post-imperial. So I very much disagree with that argument. It's even the one to say that if Ukraine falls, they'll go on to invade Baltic republics, Poland, and so on to recreate a Soviet empire, a Russian empire. That's completely false. There is absolutely no evidence for that. So yes, it's going to reassert itself as you've just suggested. No, it's not planning to rebuild an empire, or it wasn't. But in the course of war aims change, of course.
Right, fair enough. So let's go to the war breaks out. I've looked today; it's 3 years and a few days already since the war's gone started. So it's a long war in a certain sense, but it's a war of attrition, similar to the First World War. Boundaries shifted relatively quickly in the beginning. By now, it's safe to say Russia controls Crimea. They control the Donbass. How far that line will move towards the rest of Western Europe is still to be determined. From what I understand from military advisors, and I'm not an expert in military advisors, the Ukrainian army is on the verge of collapsing. Many people have said that. They say they don't have the manpower. And unless the United States or Europe actually send soldiers, which I think is unlikely because of the implications for NATO and nuclear weapons, it's safe to say the Ukrainians are very close to the brink of destruction, their army. First, do you agree with that statement? And then, if that is true, what does this mean for the peace settlement that has to come?
Mm. Certainly, Ukrainian forces are on the back foot. The shortage of manpower, and hence, of course, they're kidnapping people off the street and sending them basically with minimal training to the front. and indeed a lack of shells, a lack of equipment, and so on. And indeed, morale is beginning to fragment. And I think the Ukrainians, whether they're going to collapse, I don't know, but certainly they're on the back foot. And Russia, things have been quiet for the last few weeks, relatively quiet. But it looks as if Russia is gathering forces for a major offensive once the spring begins. So we could see exactly the scenario you've suggested, a much more rapid and important push to the west. And of course, Russia has gained more territory last year than it did in the earlier 2 years of the war, apart from the losses of autumn 2022. So it's I mean, how long can Russia continue? Ukraine continue to fight is a fundamental question. And but just to make absolutely clear, divisions or opinion is divided.
Right.
Certainly, they're on the back foot, but Ukrainians are very, very stubborn. And of course, you could say they're fighting for their country, and certainly they're under vast propaganda and media press. There's very no source of alternative information. And of course, you have this nationalist, not just patriotism, which I fully understand, but this nationalist hardcore, which is going to fight to the
Right.
bitter end.
Right. And that'll always be the case, I think, in any conflict. I want
Yeah.
to sort of talk about this conversation that happened this week between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky. Um, I've never, or at least in my life, I can't recall two heads of states confronting each other in this way, almost speaking like a boss in the office and sit down, shut up, and listen, basically. And it would seem that the Ukrainians walked out of that meeting with a bit of humiliation. So, how do you assess that meeting and its impact on diplomacy going forward and the consequences, of the war?
It's a turning point. You're absolutely right. It's almost unprecedented to have such an open conflict. As you say, none of us can remember it, and it was, it was a disaster for Ukraine, quite clearly. But then the question becomes, did Trump, and of course, interesting, J.D. Vance was sitting next to him, and next to him,
Right.
Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State. So was it an ambush? No, because Zelensky was completely ill-advised, and his comments and his way he behaved was ill-judged. He was as it were, the coming for pleading for support, and he came in, and he's got so used to the adulation in the West, so used to being treated as a neo-Churchillian figure, that he completely misjudged the way. Well, first of all, the way the situation has changed, and indeed specifically how this new Trump administration views the conflict first, and him second personally. And so, as for the conflict, they want to put an end to it, and he didn't twig that. They want to put an end to it. He wants to continue the war. How can you continue the war, which, as far as Trump and Biden, sorry, not Biden, J.D. Vance consider it, it's a lost cause first. It's a pointless war in the end, because what advantage is there to continue fighting? Will they be able to defeat Russia? Obviously not, given the fact it's a nuclear power. Even if they make battlefield gains, what are we? And Trump said it explicitly. Do you, that is, talking to Zelensky, want the Third World War? And yes, he does. He wants to escalate the war. He wants to involve the United States in a direct conflict with Russia. And of course, Trump is having none of it. And, this ambush idea that they'd come there to humiliate Zelensky, no. If you listen, and I've read the transcript and watched it 4 or 5 times, it's so amazing that, and it was Zelensky who started that sequence where they had this sort of bitter antagonism when he said to Vance, "Can I ask a question?" That was the moment when things turned. If he hadn't said it, may things would have been
Mm.
tough, but nothing like this. And then he started giving a totally false version. Almost everything that Zelensky said after that point, and no one has made this point, was a falsehood, a lie. He said that Russia didn't exchange prisoners. They did. He said about the Normandy format, Russia doesn't stick to its word. It was Zelensky who didn't. Before the Normandy meeting in Paris in December 2019, there was a deal. I don't need to go into details, but Russia's emissary, Vladislav Surkov, had got a deal and been talking with the people in Kiev. And there'd been almost daily telephone calls, they now tell me, between Putin and Zelensky before December 2019 to talk about how to implement Minsk, the sequencing, and some sort of compromise. But the day before, Zelensky met with Angela Merkel, and they agreed they'd make no deal. And this was shocking. Merkel doesn't, she hides this
Oh,
herself.
I,
But in other words, and I could go on for another half hour about the falsehoods that Zelensky gave about the war. Vance is a very smart man. He knew
yeah.
all of this. He knows this, and he wasn't going to take this nonsense anymore. The
I
nonsense
want
that
to add another
Macron's
person here.
communicating.
There's another person I want to add here, which I think is important, is Tulsi Gabbard.
Yeah.
She was on a list of bad people for Ukraine. I couldn't figure out if it was a kill list or if it was just a list of misinformation spreaders, things of this nature that she was declared. And now she's the head of national intelligence. So she's the director of national intelligence. She's now the head of the CIA. Okay. Um, already the Ukrainians, I mean, I think you said this to me in the first show we were at, showed a display of incompetent statecraft. I want you to just speak a little bit to that point where you now have head of national intelligence sort of not feeling very well about Ukraine to begin with getting into the job. As you say, JD Vance and Trump now being disrespected, and yet they are still trying to get concessions out of the United States for weapons for the war. I mean, it's an impossible position, isn't it?
And he ignored what the defense U.S. Defense Secretary, Minister of Defense or Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, had said in the Brussels Ramstein meeting a few weeks ago, where he laid out no NATO backstop, no U.S. troops there, no Article 5 guarantees. He's not listening. That you say bad statecraft. They're not listening. They thought that they could just plow on, encouraged by the Starmers and the Macrons of the world, and that they ignore what the U.S. administration has changed so fundamentally. As you say, Tulsi Gabbard, who's always been a critic of the war, she's now the director of the Office of Directorship of National Intelligence. Kash Patel is head of FBI, a new head of the CIA. All of these people are saying we don't want to own this war. And what Zelensky went to the White House, basically his agenda was to make the United States under this Trump administration own the war. Well, that was not going to end well either. So, as you say, it's a statecraft, but I think that Ukrainian statecraft has been catastrophic for decades and years, and certainly after the revolution of February 2014, when they overthrew a legitimate government, and since then it's just been antagonizing a huge neighbor, a bear next door with nuclear weapons. And indeed, I've just written a long section on why Zelensky personally is responsible for this war. His failure, once he was elected, to stick to that peace program, which the Ukrainian people wanted. So, in other words,
Yeah.
he bears a huge responsibility for this huge suffering. Of course, everybody else does as well. Biden's administration, once Biden came in January 2021, Zelensky was unleashed, and this nationalist offensive went into overdrive, supported by Boris Johnson, of course, and the British, as always, with virulent militarism, total recklessness, total disregard for the genuine interests of the mass of the people in Ukraine. And I think that's unforgivable. Unforgivable. Of course, doesn't justify the invasion. Of course not. But it's just helping to explain how this war began.
I totally agree, and that's a point that we have to keep on stressing here. None of us are, celebrating the fact that Russia invaded, but we know that the war is much more complicated. I mean, there's a lot more fingers to blame at Western leadership than they want to admit at this stage. I want to ask you about Western leadership, not the United States. I think the United States' position is becoming increasingly clear that they want to get out of this. How they get out, we're not sure. They're going for a deal, as Donald Trump said. But European leadership, there was an exchange between Macron and Trump. It was also during this month. My memories serve me not well about which day exactly. And Macron made the point, but Europe is giving most of the money or something of that stage, something of those things. It doesn't seem to me that European leadership, especially Germany and France, and the United Kingdom in particular, are seeing that they have to play a role in trying to bring the war to an end. Am I correct for interpreting that way?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm often asked about the logic of the European position, and I simply can't understand it because you would have thought that that is the British leader who met Trump, as you say, on the 27th of February, and Macron, who was in Washington on the 25th, Both of them had good meetings with Trump because of larger issues. And of course, they didn't just talk about Ukraine. On the other issues, they could make common cause. But also, don't forget the malevolent role of the European Commission under Ursula von der Leyen in all of this. And her
Right.
team now, which are virulent Russophobes, Kaya Kallas, a so-called foreign policy chief of things, they're so incompetent. Of course, she also went to Washington this week, and she was snubbed. She was due to have a meeting with Marco Rubio, and at the last moment, it was cancelled because he understood there was nothing to say. She's one of the most well. It's shocking that she's in that position, and so many others. And so the European Union, Europeans are gearing up to own this war. They've been responsible in part for its continuation for so long. But of course, they can't continue this war without the United States. So what they're planning to do, they're meeting today in London. They're meeting today, that's the 2nd of March, 2025. There's a meeting in London, and it'll be fascinating to see how they, the usual analogy is headless chickens running about trying to devise a policy which is completely devoid of reality, devoid of the substantive analysis of what's actually going on the ground. And of course, how the global political atmosphere has changed with the onset of the Trump administration. And so, what do they want? To continue this war? That they want the kids from 18 to 25 to be conscripted? That the manhood of Ukraine to be destroyed? For its infrastructure to be smashed? Why can't they? I just simply find it inconceivable. And in fact, it's almost a type of madness has seized them, and
I
especially
agree, and
summer.
it's the way I describe it is Versailles in the 17th or the 18th century, where they just totally detached from the aspirations of ordinary Europeans.
Absolutely.
Because there's interesting developments in France, and I won't be surprised if this is going to be the case in the UK and in Germany as well. We saw a bit with the AFD. But people such as Dominique de Villepin, who was the foreign minister during the Iraq War, is positioning himself for to be president of France for the next elections. You can see the media talking about it. And that might be a very interesting game changer. Somebody with empathy and high standing that can bring a narrative. And from the very beginning, he said this was due to NATO expansion. So, I mean, to what extent do you think that the European government is still stable because of these decisions?
Yes, that would be marvelous. And basically, he's the equivalent of Tulsi Gabbard and others in the US who have a totally different view of the origins of the war. Because the official version is so completely detached from reality. NATO had nothing to do with it, when even Stoltenberg, the former head of NATO, admitted it. In other words, security. That would be a game changer. I'd love to see that development in France, to be honest. But Europe is the one who's suffered the most. We've seen we're now, certainly the United Kingdom, we're just about to hit another second wave of a massive cost of living crisis, prices going up, energy prices going up, living standards going down, and of course we're dreadfully badly governed. I mean, it's such a
Right,
it's just dreadfully governed, and as you see that there's been this sort of, well, I don't like the word populist, but there
right,
certainly has been a backlash, and we saw this in the German election last weekend with the Alternative for Deutschland coming up to nearly 20%, amazing. The SDP, the Social Democrats, way down to just over 16%. And even the CDU, CSU, which basically came top, just well under 30%, which was one of their worst results. And indeed, I talk to a lot of people, and they just want to, obviously in the media, the mass media has a major role in perpetuating this logic of conflict, this logic of Cold War. But some of us, are basically saying no. This is, and first of all, the analysis is incorrect, and the political logic is incorrect. That we really now need a new peace agenda for Europe, which. And you may say this is utopian, but I say it's essential for a peace order from Lisbon to Vladivostok, because there's 150 million Russians also want peace. I mean, I've been
right.
to Russia many times, and the overwhelming desire is for peace, to get back to a normal relationship with the West, because Russians are Europeans. And I don't mean this in any denigratory form for anybody who's a non European, but just simply say it's part of European culture. And the fact that a particular incompetent and malevolent elite has seized European politics today, deliberately squeezing out the West, the left, and squeezing out people like Tulsi Gabbard equivalents. in Western polities, in France, in Germany, and indeed in the United Kingdom, where Starmer explicitly expelled them, humiliated them. When the candidate selection for our July election, so there's hardly anybody acting as dissenters, and this is exceptionally dangerous for Europe's fate.
I totally agree. Question on the Global South's role in this. South Africa notably took a position of non-alignment. The African Peace
Mm,
Initiative went, I don't know if they achieved much, but they made the point basically. One of the opening points was that Zelensky and Putin should talk to each other before this war must come to an end, something of that nature, basic diplomacy, which was a proposal. South Africa leading that position. Indonesia, India, as far as I can tell, are staying out of this. They're just saying it's your house on fire, leave us alone, on
okay.
business as usual. What do you make on the role of the Global South, and how should they position themselves going forward?
Yeah. I think that that analysis which you've suggested, and it's very widespread. We're talking about, for example, Kishore Mahbubani, the leading diplomat of Singapore, even of course China, India. They say this is another war of the global north.
Yeah,
Again, as I've suggested in that sequence, First World War, Second World War. But this time they say, don't drag us into it. It's your war, you own it. And you take the
right.
consequences. We're not going to join sanctions. Well, some do, of course, but mostly don't. They say, you just get on with it, and your incompetence in not avoiding an unavoidable war. And the global south has matured. It's now matured, and we look to countries like South Africa, Brazil, you mentioned Indonesia, Mexico, to act and many other African countries, Egypt in particular, and Ethiopia. Well, the list is endless, quite long.
Mhm.
To take a more active part, and of course they are. We're talking about BRICS plus is now 10 members. Indonesia joined a few weeks ago, and this is a game changer. And in some ways, I talked about this political West, which is now fragmenting because what we're seeing is the defection of the United States from the organization and alliance system that it itself created after the end of the Second World War. It's equivalent, I say, to the way in the collapse of the Soviet Union, that what was most unexpected was that Russia took the lead in leaving the Soviet Union in the
Yeah.
late 1980s, early 90s. And so today, it's the United States saying that that system does not work globally. Of course, there's plenty of things we can criticize about the way it's doing it. But for example, my big criticism is that in rejecting globalism, if you like, the old-fashioned globalism and the political West, the global West, it is also abandoning the Charter international system. It's leaving United Nations organization,
Mm.
agencies, World Health Organization, UNESCO, and so on. It's planning to. I find that very, very regrettable, and it's undermining multilateralism, and I'm a great committed to that. So the global South, in other words, bottom line, should support the United Nations, the Charter international system, make its voice heard in the General Assembly, and when its members are elected as alternate members of the UN Security Council, not to be bullied by the Anglo-Americans, which they have been. As you know, they're
Yeah.
constantly threatened when it comes to votes. And in the UN General Assembly, Washington has been shameless in the Biden administration with London support and French support to bully people in voting. I mean, we've so many stories now coming out, by the way. It's shocking the way that they've abused the United Nations. So what the Global South should do is to say to them, don't have your spillover effects of this war destroying our institution, that is the United Nations and its agencies and
Do
its
you?
principles.
Well, I'm going to ask you to speculate a bit here, but is there a possibility of reforming the Security Council coming out of this war?
No. It's needed, of course. India, possibly other countries. Well, certainly an African representative or two. Brazil, clearly, these are leading contenders. I don't think that United Kingdom and France still deserve a seat. Maybe France as a representative of the European Union, but some people in the past would say
Yeah.
Japan, the United States. But why Japan? It will just vote with the West. What's the point? So it is. Yeah, but it's not. I don't think that's the thing about the United Nations is it was a compromise when it was established in 1945. It's a compromise in great power politics, hence the five permanent members, and also, of course, the larger vision of a committee of nations, which is now 193 strong. Uh, and I would say that the reform should come, and there's plenty of little things we could do, but reform should come. First of all, it should work. The United States should be forced, made to work the way it was intended to work. That would be an achievement. And second, that when international politics allows it, when Britain, France, the Europeans, and the United States move on, and with Russia and China, and then to move and to agree how best to move forwards on the basis of cooperation and not in conflict. Otherwise, we will destroy the whole system entirely. The danger is that we destabilize it. So it's not perfect, far from perfect, but it's the best we could have. And let's hang on to what we've got.
I agree with that. It's not perfect, but it is still defensible. A question, so last question here is the peace that will come. And with peace obviously comes the Ukrainian humiliation, which we're now seeing this, that process is happening, regrettable as it might be, and also reconciliation going forward to prevent, I would say, an ugly nationalism taking hold in Ukraine. That has to be suppressed. So how would one manage that?
Yeah, it's that's why so many people say the war's not going to end anytime soon. So you're absolutely right. There's no clear immediate pathway, but the conditions are absolutely right. The ones that South Africa, Brazil, China have outlined. There has to be reconciliation. There's no point having a ceasefire just for the war to continue, or to have a North Korea division or
Mm.
Kashmir, which just lasts for decades upon decades. So we need a whole package solution, and that it also has to work at the four levels I mentioned earlier. Peace within Ukraine, that these ultra nationalists have to be tamed, constrained, limited, and the genuine, the other Ukraine, which are generous, open hearted, tolerant, and multilingual, multicultural, that Ukraine must be given a voice. And and with the support of Trump, it won't get the support of Europeans at this point, but they want this sectarian Ukraine to continue, and that's well the one they're supporting. Uh, so you're absolutely right. So I mean that's the key point. We have to move, and more than that, the second level, reconciliation between Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah.
After a war, there's a deep bitterness on both sides. Of course, Ukrainians are upset. Of course they are, but so are Russians, because Ukrainians effectively allowed themselves to be in a position where a war was provoked, and maybe Russia shouldn't have risen to the
Well,
provocation.
I would say what if there's ever somebody listening in a position of authority, what I would propose, and I'd like your view on this, it's a combination between a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and also a Nuremberg Tribunal. I do believe that somehow there must be a prosecution for high-level politicians who were knowingly, responsible for the war. And that might even include Russians, although that's unlikely to occur. And at the same time, there must be an attempt at a common memory. What happened? Why did it break up? A common establishment of facts, so nobody can keep on denying it in the future going forward. And if I look at the failures of the Nuremberg Tribunal and the failures of the Truth and Reconciliation and the successes of both in South Africa and Germany separately, it was because one went too far in the other direction. You know,
Uh, as for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I'm dubious, but I mean you've
yeah,
got close and you know it very closely, and I've read your pieces on it, fascinating. Yes, possibly, but but in the sense that maybe after a little bit of time has passed, because the wounds are so raw at the moment.
yeah,
Um, and ultimately, nations are made and peace is made often by as much by forgetting in the first instance. And then historians can do their job. But I don't mean by that suppressing the truth. I mean, obviously, we as academics, scholars, journalists, we have to, tell the truth. That's as we see it, as the best we see it. As for Nuremberg Tribunal, that I would not agree with,
right,
because because the first person to be put on it would be Biden and his team, Biden, Sullivan, and Blinken, and of course Victoria Nuland and all of these people. They are responsible for this war. I mean, it's as simple as that. I'm sorry.
yeah,
And the neocons and the liberal interventionists, they made this war. Everybody else then became effectively victims of it. And of course, then Zelensky's way and the ultra nationalists. But the point is, you're not going to put Blinken, and of course, the European leaders who, and Boris Johnson should definitely be in there. So, what we're talking about, they're not going to, it's going to be
right.
selective.
We're talking about actual application of international law, which is
Yeah.
not going to happen.
Yeah. No, and of course Russia did invade. So clearly, even though they would justify it in terms of Article 51 of the UN Charter, but I think that's it's a valid argument, but it's not a wholly convincing one. I mean,
Right.
no, so there's points of validity in that. So let's not deny that they were, and just finishing to say that if they go if and this is what again, I don't want to go into detail, but it did look as if the United States would have been placed. They didn't say they wouldn't. Aegis Ashore missile launch systems, which can launch nuclear tipped Tomahawk missiles, which takes about 2 minutes to get to Moscow. Now, if you had somebody doing that in your neighbor in Zimbabwe or Mexico, Canada, if you're in the US, it would be your responsibility as a leader to stop that.
No.
And so Putin would say that was his responsibility. And of course, Ukrainians were willing to do it. So, I mean, they would, of course, Zelensky would have said, do it. And he even hinted to become a nuclear power at the Munich Security Conference in February 2022. So, it would open up. So these wounds are harsh and raw. Let time be the healer. Let reconciliation work on the grassroots. Let us rebuild Ukraine as a prosperous, independent, sovereign state, but neutral and not militarized.
I agree with that. Last question here. How long do you reckon, if you were to predict the future, which is obviously difficult, before we actually see end of hostilities and peace
Yeah.
coming forward?
Yeah, no, I wonder. I think about this every day, and when at the more optimistic moments, as I said, Trump and his team are very flawed vessels, but they're saying things that should have been said 30 years ago. And so, but finally, I'm delighted that they are finally saying it. And this Trumpian disruption opens up. It's a whole open historical moment, and they will now maybe force Ukraine to peace. So after this meeting, this on Friday, the 28th of February.
Well, should
So
should Ukraine be at the peace table? That's also a question I have, because at the
yeah,
moment, I mean, the last one in Saudi Arabia was two great powers negotiating for the future of Ukraine. It looked like the Conference of Berlin to me.
well, the point is that it affects everybody. It affects all of humanity, and they have a responsibility as UN permanent members to avoid a third world war. So it's
Right.
absolutely legitimate for them to discuss not just Ukraine, but they discussed arms control and many other issues. So it is Ukraine has got nothing to do with that, and in fact. Ukraine, of course, wants to continue the war. This leadership, so
Right.
they should not be there. They at the end, obviously Ukraine has to be at the table, but so far, and the Europeans, but as many people have been saying, not only didn't they have a table, they didn't even have a room in which to put the table for the last 3 years, and then they demand to be at a table which they've rejected for 3 years. It seems bizarre to me. They
Yeah.
said, we're not going to talk peace. We're not even going to talk to Putin or the Russians. So, and then suddenly now they want to, when somebody else starts to talk, oh no, please, we want to talk as well. But they're not going to talk. They just do megaphone diplomacy and condemnations with these present leaders until they begin to understand how the situation is sort of things we've been talking about in this session today. Then I just hope they watch it. To be honest.
Well, Richard, I hope Zelensky is watching you, but thank you very much for this conversation. I appreciate it. And let's hope that the war ends before our next conversation. But you're always welcome back here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and it's always enjoyable talking with you. Thank you very much.
All right.